The 28th of June 2019. What is left of the Morandi Bridge crashes to the ground in a meticulously planned explosion. There is no celebration, just sadness. This is a bridge that killed 43 people and destroyed hundreds of lives in one of the most absurd infrastructure catastrophes of all time. The bridge that was once the gateway to Europe and the Mediterranean for millions of people is no more. The death knell for the Morandi Bridge in Genoa had rung out at 11:46 a.m., just 9.5 months earlier. Genoa, Italy. It is August the 14th, the day before Italy's biggest summer holiday. The towering concrete icon of the Morandi Bridge collapses into a jagged heap. Trucks and cars shoot into the void and plunge to the riverbed 50 meters below. People working under the bridge are crushed. 43 people lie dead in their vehicles or under the rubble.
A un certo punto mi sono trovato a volare giù.
Suddenly I found myself plummeting together with the whole bridge, with the front of my car pointing downwards. I instinctively took my hands off the wheel and put them behind my head. I thought I was dead.
Ho pensato di essere morto.
A un certo punto sento un tuono fortissimo.
Suddenly I hear a loud noise. I was looking at my tablet and I hear my colleague Luigi shout, "What the f***'s going on?" I look up and it was just like in the films. There were cracks in the road and we fall down.
E mi ricordo che sprofondiamo giù.
The collapse of the Morandi Bridge, Genoa's very own Brooklyn Bridge, is the worst road disaster ever to befall Italy. The mountain of twisted metal and crushed concrete left behind became a symbol of both human achievement and failure. What exactly went wrong that day and triggered the sequence of events that brought down the Morandi Bridge may never be known, but a fault in the original design and delayed repair work almost certainly contributed significantly to the disaster. It's the morning of the 14th of August 2018, 51 years after the Morandi Bridge in Genoa was opened. Torrential rain pours onto the vehicles as the cell phone of this truck driver records. He is on his way to France and filming the thunderstorm. Filmed in the other direction is CCTV footage of the motorway company. They both identify the green Basco truck and a grey Volkswagen Tiguan overtaking it. They both record the last living moments of 43 people and the final few seconds of the 50-year-old Morandi Bridge. Davide Capello is at the wheel of the Tiguan. This is the first time he has seen this video. He sees his own car just a few seconds before the disaster.
Mi sono messo nella corsia di sinistra perché dovevo andare verso Genova Ovest e ho superato una serie di macchine.
I got into the left lane because I had to go towards Genoa West, and I overtook a number of cars. When I get to the point of the famous 9th pylon, I hear a dull rumble that surrounds me. I begin to see dust falling from above, small debris, and I look in front of me and see the road undulating, and a semicircular gap opens up 15 meters ahead of me, 10, 15 meters.
Una voragine semicircolare davanti a circa 15 metri da me, 10 metri. Oddio! Oddio! Mi ricordo sempre di una macchina che...
I remember a car that fell down like this, and I witnessed the whole scene without being able to do anything. I instinctively took my hands off the wheel and put them behind my head. I thought I was dead. I knew immediately what was happening, because in any case, I saw the bridge collapse, the tarmac fall down, the cars disappear into the void. So I realized from the outset that it was the bridge that was collapsing.
Le macchine sparire nel vuoto. Quindi sin dal primo istante mi sono reso conto che era il ponte che andava giù.
Gianluca Ardini and his colleague were delivering furniture when they flew off the bridge in their white truck.
Quando mi rendo conto di come sono messo, mi giro verso...
When I realised where I am, I turned towards Luigi, whose head is on the steering wheel. I try to touch him with my left arm, but it doesn't seem like an arm at all, so I touch him with my right hand, and he shows no sign of life, so I realise he's dead.
Percepisco che fosse morto.
Beneath the bridge, workers from the local waste recycling company witness the bridge fall onto colleagues. They cannot know what is happening or the extent of the disaster. As the bridge collapses, drivers slam on their brakes. Dozens of cars in front of them plunge into the void. The rain is still torrential. In the meantime, police and firemen begin rushing to the scene. The first to arrive face a grim scene of death and destruction. Richard Bordoni is a British-born Italian firefighter. He was on duty in the Pavia fire station and is the leader of an urban search and rescue team.
There was a thunderstorm, a severe weather. There was a thunderstorm, and we saw that a huge span of the bridge was missing. Even if we didn't figure out, how severe the damage was, and we didn't even know how many vehicles were involved in it. What I saw was those huge concrete blocks. There were massive reinforced concrete blocks were part of the pier that had just collapsed with the stays.
E vedevo solo buio e sentivo la polvere. Ho provato a levarmi la cintura.
All I could see was darkness, and I could smell the dust. I tried to take my seatbelt off to try to understand where I really was, where I had been stopped. So I took a look out of the car's rear window pane that had broken, and all I could see was debris, dust. There was no one there.
Detriti, solo polvere, non c'era nessuno.
Quando realizzo dov'ero, che ho cercato di vedere da quel poco che rimaneva del finestrino, ho visto che mancavano ancora una decina di metri più o meno.
When I realised where I am, I tried to look out of what was left of my window, and I realised that I was more or less 10 metres off the ground. I thought to myself, damn, I've survived and now I'm going to fall further. And the truck was moving. I panicked because I couldn't feel my legs and I thought I'd been paralysed. But I could sort of feel them, so I thought, maybe I've just broken my back. I began crying and I said to myself, hey Dan, calm down. You've got to calm down till they get you down.
Stiamo calmi che ci facciamo tirare giù.
It was wet. It was still wet. It just finished raining. There was a lot of dust because of a huge dust cloud. There were some people still moaning or complaining, asking for help, and we had rescue workers, firefighters working on them and rescuing them, supporting the ambulance service too. And after it was just machinery, our machinery working on the top of the rubble.
Era un silenzio quasi...
An unnatural silence. The first time I looked out, I could only see rubble. Nothing was moving. It was as silent as a grave.
Un silenzio tombale.
The urban search and rescue teams of Italy's fire brigade have swung into action in all of Italy's great natural disasters. These men and women have no time to be shocked. They have a protocol to follow. And on the Morandi Bridge on the 14th of August 2018, it was particularly challenging. Our
capability and capacity is breaching and breaking concrete. We are capable of doing that. We usually work on standard structures or high-rise buildings or stone-made buildings. We are capable of breaking and breaching through floors and walls. What we are not used to, and we've never tested, is breaching through so overwhelming pieces of concrete. So we knew we needed extra resources to do this job.
As the rain cleared up, the extent of the disaster became apparent.
As soon as the command post was set up, one of the first job is tactical and strategical planning, and one of the most important pieces of information that you need is how many people are missing, how many people you have to rescue. To get this information, it's very, very difficult. I mean, that road is the motorway, it's a major motorway, it's called the A10. It's also used as a ring road by the locals, and it connects the western area of Genoa to the eastern area where the port is. So a lot of lorries, lots of heavy vehicles, a lot of goods, also dangerous goods, and a lot of holidaymakers.
Within minutes, hundreds of firefighters and civil defense operatives began reaching the disaster scene. Isolated and confused, Davide Capello did not know that a whole span of the bridge had collapsed.
Dopo ho chiamato la mia fidanzata.
I called my girlfriend, who at first didn't answer, so I called my dad. I spoke to him and told him where I was and what had happened. He was silent. He didn't quite realize.
Perché a me non realizzava.
We had to find out where we could work safely and where there was less risk, and where we could find cars and vehicles where we're looking for the entrapped persons. We didn't want to breach through rubble. What we were looking for was the missing.
Come emozioni, penso quella più grande era...
The strongest emotions I felt were for my girlfriend who was pregnant, and Pietro was born a month later. I had to stay alive at all costs to be able to see my son. I think that was the strongest feeling I had at that time, but obviously you think of many things, such as your family, but that's the main thing.
We were working with the police law enforcement, all the police forces involved in the rescue operations, because we needed to know how many people were reported missing. And also looking at CCTV images, we tried to find out how many vehicles were involved, not only cars, but also heavy goods vehicles or lorries.
Dangling in separate cars at opposite ends of the collapsed bridge, Davide Capello and Gianluca Ardini both realized where they were, but were still at great risk and exposed to falling debris. Ardini had life-threatening injuries.
Quando ho sentito I primi elicotteri, le prime sirene, mi sono proprio più calmato perché ho detto dai.
When I heard the first helicopters, the first sirens, I calmed down. And in those moments, those hours, because I was there for 4 hours, they told me 4 hours. That seemed 3 days to me, the longest hours of my life. They had to stabilize the truck because it could have fallen further, and in the meantime I'd changed position. I'd been able to take off my seatbelt because I had a broken pelvis and it hurt badly, and I lay down near the pedals because the truck was head down. So I managed to lay down there, and every now and again I had to move, but they shouted, "Keep still, keep still."
Per ogni tot mi dovevo muovere, sentivo le urla, stai fermo, stai fermo.
Il terrore che avevo io in quel momento era di poter precipitare ancora più giù, però poi...
The great fear I had was that my car could fall further down. But in actual fact, it was almost parked inside a space in that span of the motorway that turned over as it collapsed, and I ended up inside. Almost parked inside. And that protected me from the collapse of anything else.
Dall'eventuale crollo di qualcos'altro.
Within a few hours of the bridge collapse, the main road arteries along the river were blocked off and crowded with emergency services, now working around the clock to account for every single missing person.
We were carrying out search and rescue with canine units and trying to find them under the rubble. So that's part of the user work, to find people under the rubble using canines, so that's dog search, and also using electronic devices. That means listening devices, so we can hear if anybody's alive under the rubble, and search cameras too. We're using infrared cameras and search cameras to look through the rubble and see if we can find anybody under there.
Comunque cercavo di dare indizi per farmi trovare.
I tried to help them find me. First, since I had a pain in my pelvis, I took my seatbelt off and got into a position where I could keep more still, because the truck was moving a lot, and there was a risk it could fall further. I cooperated quite a lot with the firemen because I wanted to get out at any cost. Using just the right arm, I was able to sit astride the window, and they got me down.
Di quello che rimaneva del finestrino e poi mi hanno tirato giù.
Ma io probabilmente non...
I think I couldn't have avoided it. I think that was my destiny. I don't have any other explanation. I think I had to be at that place at that time, but that my time had not come yet.
Trovare lì in quel momento e che non fosse la mia ora.
Those living in the homes below were also confused and terrified.
Ho sentito questo grandissimo tuono.
I heard this enormous clap of thunder because I immediately thought it was thunder. The pavement began trembling, so I thought the lightning had struck the ground. Hard, very hard. I went into the big door and I went back home. I heard screaming. I heard the people of the upper floors screaming. And I thought, how silly. It's over. It's just thunder. I heard my daughter screaming on the staircase. I reached her and she said, "Mum, let's get out. The bridge has collapsed."
È caduto il ponte.
More than 600 people were evacuated from the surrounding neighborhood as the threatening remnants of what was once an engineering marvel teetered dangerously over their homes.
Sono andata in casa.
I went into the apartment, got my cat straight away, and looked from the terrace of the house to see if it really was the bridge, because it was something that we never thought. It was unthinkable that the bridge could collapse. I saw the spans. I didn't wait around. I didn't see trucks. I didn't see anything. I just saw this missing piece.
Questo pezzo mancante.
What had happened to the brilliant bridge built by engineer Riccardo Morandi? The stay bridge he designed was solid, elegant and inexpensive, and built without destroying the homes below. Michele Calvi is a professor of civil engineering and a well-known expert on building safety. He has studied the catastrophe as an independent expert.
Morandi took as his remit the fact that he had to interact as little as possible with the buildings below the bridge. That was the goal. Even just the fact that the 36-meter supporting beams, the ones resting on the pylons, were built using prefabricated beams that were set in position using cranes. So working only from above the platform is proof of the situation. Additional to this is that the platform was built using molds that were 5 or 5.5 meters long, and working on top of the platform, what we would call today a segmented construction, which at the time was an unknown and non-standard technique.
The Morandi Bridge was a cable stay design. Unlike suspension bridges that hang from cables attached to anchors at each end of the bridge, stay cable structures use thick cables set astride a saddle on top of a concrete tower to actually hold up the road itself, creating a fan-like support structure.
Obviously, today, a stay bridge is a bridge with a large redundancy factor. Today, if 1 or 2 cables are cut, the bridge doesn't collapse. In fact, almost nothing happens. That bridge, on the other hand, if you remove one of the stays, obviously collapses. Everyone says that, not only after the events, but any sensible engineer, if asked, Would the bridge stand if one stay were missing? Obviously, they'd say no. So that was a bridge with little redundancy.
The city of Genoa occupies a narrow stretch of land between the sea and the mountains. The two ports here are vital hubs for international trade and travel. Before it was demolished, this was all that was left of one of the primary infrastructure links between the north and west of Europe and the whole of the Mediterranean basin. The Morandi Bridge was built in a strategic position within the city of Genoa, but it was also in an incredibly inaccessible place. A little more than a kilometre long, it crossed the Polcevera Valley, a river, a railway depot, a densely populated area, and several large factories at an average height of 45 metres above the ground. The container port to the west was connected to the rest of Italy over the same bridge. The construction design, based on dozens of strands encased in concrete and attached to tall A-shaped pylons, was revolutionary for its time.
Lui ha utilizzato un numero molto importante di trefoli.
He uses a large number of strands to connect the platforms that had already been built to keep the platforms suspended. Then he connects the stay, which is in compressed concrete, and as loads are applied, the concrete is decompressed, so that with the same loads, the stay movement is much smaller. Smaller movements mean greater stability in the platforms, reducing fatigue, so the structure is more healthy. And from this point of view and from the conceptual standpoint, I'd say there's nothing wrong with this solution.
Profilo concettuale, io direi che non c'è proprio nulla da dire sul fatto che questa soluzione potesse funzionare.
When the stays were examined 30 years later, the steel strands on the easternmost platform were found to be corroded through 30% of their width, so the stays were replaced with new steel strands. The concrete had not been fully injected, leaving cavities around the steel cables. Professor of Civil Engineering Michele Calvi has run complex computer models to come up with some surprising insights into the real state of the bridge.
Il fatto che quei cavi di fatto non siano stati iniettati.
The fact that those stays were not injected was a known fact. If you go and see the pictures dating back to the 1990s, where they looked, there was no trace, or a tiny trace of injection. Can this have had an effect on the bridge? As a direct cause of the collapse, I would say no. But that it could have contributed generally, or more specifically, locally to corrosion, I'd say yes.
Probabilmente in modo locale dei fenomeni di corrosione, questo sì.
Engineers reviewing the safety of the structure at the time did not suggest the bridge was dangerous or at imminent risk of collapse.
Da quello che si legge negli articoli degli anni 90, si legge che la corrosione...
From what we read in articles of the 1990s, that the corrosion was far more advanced in this particular structural element, while in the others it was far less advanced. And we read that they carried out a number of mathematical models that are not specified in the reports of the time. And we read that serious problems with the other two structures would occur several decades later, and there was no urgent need to intervene.
Quindi non c'era questa urgenza di intervenire.
Until its collapse, 3,000 lorries drove over this bridge each day, transporting goods as far as to and from Portugal, Spain, and France. 2.5 million containers are unloaded at the two main port terminals. More than 4 million people board cruise ships or ferries in Genoa each year as well. The bridge was a gateway to Europe and beyond for goods and people, and yet the need for critical repairs was no secret. Eventually, plans for a new bridge were shelved, and the privately owned Autostrade per l'Italia proposed changing the stays. The date set was 2 months after the collapse. The weakness of the bridge lay on the lack of redundancy in the stays, but for the most part, it was solid and stable.
Il fatto che tutto il ponte crolli è certamente connesso a questa
The fact that the whole bridge collapsed is certainly connected to the fact that the bridge has little redundancy. It's almost rigid. If one element disappears, the whole bridge ceases to work. This doesn't mean that any local item can cause the whole bridge to collapse. So we asked ourselves if a massive impact on a part of the platform might bring about an overall collapse. But from our models, we see that this would not have brought about the collapse of the whole bridge.
completo del ponte.
So, according to engineer Michele Calvi, it could not have been the weight of traffic to have caused the disaster. The bridge was in fact hollow between the road surface and its base.
Il tratto di strada che mi precedeva.
The road segment in front of me is built on 2 levels, and between these 2 levels is a space, and I ended up inside as the segment was turning over. I went right in there.
Probabilmente si è capovolto, io sono entrato proprio in mezzo.
There was huge voids, even if one huge section of the bridge, it was the deck of the bridge, basically overturned, and some cars were there, some other vehicles too. They were also squashed. Some were underneath the rubble, but the majority were basically on top. We did have to remove a lot of rubble to find other cars, but unfortunately we didn't find any live people inside.
These publicly available CCTV images of the bridge just before it collapses show the traffic is regular and continues until the red brake lights begin showing the cars stopping short of the giant gap. As the rain fell, so did the reinforced concrete. This CCTV film from the local waste recycling centre below shows men passing by just before the concrete begins to crash into the plant. A lucky cat survives. A few minutes later, the torrential rain stopped and only rubble remained. By noon on the 14th of August 2018, the Fire Brigade urban search and rescue teams were picking through the rubble of the collapsed Morandi Bridge, searching for survivors. Just 2 of the people who fell from the top of the bridge made it out alive. The teams first had to identify who they were looking for and then find them.
Well, like any kind of major incident, anybody involved is part of the rescue efforts. And well, as soon as a lot of the specialised team came in from all the agencies, not only from the fire service, from the bystanders, we got the information basically. They weren't supporting us, rescuing people. We were gathering information from there to find out what they saw, and we wanted to know how many people were involved in this collapse.
The list of missing people reached nearly 100 as people called the toll-free line in search of their loved ones. But as time passed, either they were accounted for and found alive, mostly elsewhere, or they were identified among the victims. The forensic police were on the scene to identify body parts and DNA.
We didn't have a clue how many vehicles were on top. You could just see the scenario. You could count the vehicles on the riverbed or where they fell. And so we started working on checking CCTV footage. There was a toll-free number which was activated for reporting missing people. And what happens is after a few hours, we had a number of roughly 40 persons missing from involved. And after a few hours during the night, that figure just went up to 80, 100.
As the urban search and rescue teams ploughed through the remains of the bridge, family members endured a desperate wait for news of their loved ones. One woman flew in all the way from Jamaica.
Well, the one that really touched me was talking to the relatives of the Jamaican family. We didn't expect it. We had the Red Cross coming in, a psychological support unit. They wanted to talk to the commander in charge of the rescue outfit because she was begging the rescue service to do all they could to rescue their relatives. The first thing I asked is, what have you been told? What do you know? And well, she had in the back of her mind this thought of finding them still alive, even if she knew they weren't.
In the meantime, the investigation was underway. Although Michele Calvi was called by families of the victims to provide expert testimony in the investigation, he preferred to remain neutral and investigate for himself.
We used a particularly advanced model that allowed us to simulate what happens to the bridge with parts moving long distances, so simulating the collapse up to its conclusion. This model allowed us to understand where the parts of the bridge ended up on the ground. So this model was fundamental. But I would never have trusted this model if we hadn't used the traditional methods and other approaches that I have just touched on, and had I not seen that the results were coherent amongst themselves.
C'era coerenza fra questi risultati.
His conclusions are surprising, and despite the various theories presented in the courts and in the media, he sustains that the Morandi Bridge was solid.
Puro incremento di corrosione.
An increase in corrosion alone would not have caused an overall collapse, without showing signs that it was about to happen. It could be the collapse of a stay, due to problems at the connection with the platform, or above, at the connection with the top of the pylon. After that, the other events are consequential. So the collapse of the platform through breakage and torsion is connected to this.
Taglio, torsione dell'impalcato è connesso a questo.
The engineering of the bridge was such that even if the cables were corroded, the effect would simply to have been the extension of the stays, as the pre-tensioned concrete would have been decompressed. With corrosion of up to 60% of the cables, the bridge would have sunk by 40 centimetres, an event that would have been noticed by the workers on the bridge that day or by anyone passing by. Analysis of photographs of the rubble have led Michele Calvi to conclude that only a catastrophic collapse of one of the connections of the stays would have produced a pattern of debris like the one that was found.
Using this kind of modeling, we find a distribution of debris on the ground that is very similar to the distribution of debris that we see in the photographs available. So as a result, I could conclude that for some reason, in my opinion, one of the stays gave way. And in particular, in my opinion, it was the southwestern stay.
The collapsing bridge threw dozens of vehicles into the void, crashing into the ground below.
Those involved fell off a bridge and fell between 40 and 50 metres. It was a huge drop. So the cars they crashed to the riverbed or on top of other buildings, or were crushed by the huge blocks of concrete. So that was the major cause of death.
Down in the valley, Richard Bordoni and the USAR teams reduced the number of missing people, dead and alive, down to 3. They pored over CCTV images from the highway to determine how many cars might have been on the bridge when it fell. One car was missing, and they found it on the 5th day. Aboard were Christian Cecala, his wife Donna, and their 9-year-old daughter, Crystal.
The last car was a Hyundai i20 LPG car. The first part of this car was found in the air, basically stamped onto the concrete. It was the back panel, seat panel, and so we sent some colleagues underneath from the bottom, so we opened up a hole at the bottom of the rubble, and we basically found an engine.
The experience that each USAR member has gained while working in confined spaces proved key in identifying the vehicle.
And using his camera, he took a picture and managed to take note of the registration of the frame. And with this number, we had the confirmation that it was a Hyundai i20 LPG, and that's what we were looking for.
The family of 3 was the last to be found. They had been on their way to their holidays.
We knew we were looking for a family of 3. That's 2 adults and their daughter, a 9-year-old daughter. And that was the last one, and we were working, all our efforts were concentrated on that one because we knew that on that card there were 3 persons on board.
Other victims of the tragedy included cameraman and journalist Gianni Battiloro, who was travelling with friends Matteo Bertonati, Gerardo Esposito and Antonio Stanzione. Andrea Vittone, Claudia Possetti and their 2 children from Pinerolo, Piedmont, were also killed. The Robbiano family was wiped out. Father Roberto and his wife Ercilia died together with their 8-year-old child. Another 30 also died on that day.
Ho fatto 55 giorni, mi sembra, 58 giorni d'ospedale e ho fatto fisioterapia tuttora la faccio.
I spent 58 days in the hospital and did physiotherapy, and I'm still doing it to regain the use of my arm. As for injuries, I injured my retina, my arm, my pectoral muscles, with deep cuts made by the seatbelt. I broke my arm, my elbow, my ribs, pelvis in 2 places, a vertebra. It changed me psychologically a lot. I'm certainly not the same man I was.
Psicologicamente mi ha cambiato tanto, perché comunque non sono quello di prima sicuramente.
Ma io non ho riportato grosse lesioni
I didn't suffer serious injuries. Mainly, a few vertebrae were compressed during the impact. I have shoulder problems, but given the fall and everything that happened, it's almost nothing.
Per il volo che ho fatto e quello che è successo è quasi niente.
Several workers at the waste recycling plant were buried by tons of reinforced concrete that fell from 50 meters. Their colleagues raised the alarm.
We had one colleague of one of the missing, which had started his first day of work at the waste factory, and he reported that he was sure that his colleague was there under the rubble somewhere because he started his job in the morning and then they couldn't get in touch with him. So they were telling us to find him, and was most probably involved under the collapse near the parking area of the waste collection company.
Possiamo chiamarlo in tutti i modi perché
We can call it anything we like. Luck? I'd say the word miracle is inappropriate because it's unfair towards those who didn't share my fate. But it's unexplainable.
We started on Tuesday the 14th, and it was Saturday morning when we found the last deceased person, and we were sure, 100% sure, that nobody else was involved in the collapse.
The city of Genoa, home to more than 500,000 people, was also left struggling by the collapse of its iconic Morandi Bridge. The tragedy left 43 dead and shocked Italians, who began to ask just how safe the rest of the nation's aging highway infrastructure really was. And why hadn't all the stays been repaired when they were found to be corroded?
Non voglio fare il procuratore della Repubblica che dice che la gente doveva pensarci.
I don't want to usurp the role of the prosecutor who says that someone should have known. But I can say that massive work was done in the 1990s on one of the pylons, and nothing else was done afterwards. And that is very strange, because the 3 systems are very similar, if not identical. And the fact that corrosion was already identified as a problem, even if I say it wasn't the main and fundamental cause of the collapse. This does not excuse the fact that the structures were monitored ineffectively.
The city's head prosecutor was now able to visit the site and begin trying to understand what had gone wrong. The investigation got underway and vital footage was gathered from CCTV cameras, including some still secret footage taken from the bridge itself. The city remained cut in two, causing untold damage to its finances. Who was responsible? According to Michele Calvi, there was no forewarning of catastrophic collapse.
If someone had asked me about the bridge a month before, 2 months before, 3 months before, would I have had it closed? Don't think this is an easy question. I've had bridges closed. I've had stretches of road closed. So the question is, would I have had the bridge closed? I would not have closed it. I don't have any doubt about that. There was a plan to reinforce it that had been through several commissions. If I had been on those commissions and seen those plans, would I have had the bridge closed? Frankly, I don't think so. I think I would have done everything to accelerate the process of reinforcement, but I don't think I'd have had the bridge closed.
Whatever or whoever was responsible for the deaths of 43 people under the rubble of the Morandi Bridge remains to be determined by the courts in legal and criminal proceedings likely to drag on for decades. Davide Capello remains in shock.
Il pensiero di quel giorno lo vivo quotidianamente. Perché è una cosa
I relive that day every day. It's not something you can forget, so now and again I have a nightmare.
Ogni tanto qualche incubo si presenta, qualche sensazione.
You get these sensations unexpectedly during the day, so it's something that has marked me for life.
Quindi comunque è una cosa che mi ha segnato per tutta la vita.
Sono terrorizzato adesso, comunque sono in cura, piglio farmaci.
I take medication, I go to the psychologist, and I hope that over time, although I'll never forget, maybe I'll learn to live with it.
Perché è impossibile, però magari a conviverci.
Like many engineering disasters of national significance, the Morandi Bridge catastrophe has left a wake of mistrust in the nation's institutions, especially in the infrastructures that have not been overhauled since the booming 1990s.
There is a general infrastructure issue in Italy, in France, in Germany, and everywhere. It is not a problem we can go on hiding. It is such a huge problem that it requires an approach that is different from the usual approach. We can't simply do spot checks and decide to intervene on this bridge or that bridge. In my opinion, we need to proceed, if I may say this, by filters. So if we have 20,000 bridges or 30,000 bridges, we need to do an initial selection of bridges that certainly present high risks, and then fix those, and leave aside those that can be dealt with in 50 years.
Not only are Europe's infrastructures aging, but there is also evidence showing that structural integrity reports may have been falsified by the private motorway franchise holders in Italy to avoid the cost of repair and upgrading. When you get on the road, you can't be afraid that the road will collapse under your car. You have to be afraid of getting distracted, of having an accident. Not that the tarmac under your wheels disappears. This is impossible. It just can't happen. The city of Genoa has blown up the remains of the Morandi Bridge once and for all. Hundreds of people have been moved into temporary accommodation, and the whole city is paying the price of losing its strategic place among Europe's commercial hubs. More than a year went by before work on erecting the pylons for a new bridge finally began.
They should have reopened the bridge 3 months after the collapse. 3 months after the collapse. Because opening the bridge, in my opinion, was more important than anything else. So don't tell me it has to be beautiful and so forth. That bridge had a structure that was still standing for the most part and maintaining the basic safety standards. They could have immediately begun planning. There are such things as Bailey bridges, bridges that can be built in 3 days. Julius Caesar tells us that he built a bridge on the Rhine in a few days, and we still have the construction plans, and we take 2 years to do the same thing. I think it's ridiculous.
The pylons of the original Morandi Bridge were blown up on the 24th of June 2019, 10 months after the catastrophic collapse of 2 spans of the bridge. It was a milestone in the building of the new, equally iconic bridge designed by famed Genoese architect Renzo Piano. The plan to give Genoa a new bridge to keep its port relevant to international trade and keep traffic flowing from east to west and north to south got off to a very slow start. With the storms of political crisis rumbling in the background, the decaying infrastructures in Italy and Europe were once again forgotten, shut away until the next catastrophe crashes into the headlines. London, England. A vibrant financial centre where steel and glass palaces rise from the banks of the River Thames, which winds through the bustling capital city that 8 million people call home.
A massive fire right now in a West London tower block. We'll speak to our reporter live at the scene. The London Fire Brigade right now are dealing with a serious fire in a tower block, Grenfell Tower, 23-storey residential block of flats in Kensington.
On the 14th of June 2017, just before 1 a.m, a fire broke out inside apartment 16 on the 4th floor of a 23-storey high-rise tower block in West London known as the Grenfell Tower. Within 20 minutes, the whole building was ablaze. The building materials and cladding used in a controversial renovation burnt like a match. 72 people died in the catastrophe.
We're stuck on the 23rd floor! Hello!
When I saw the fire, I said, bloody hell, now the fire is, that's when, I got a bit more nervous.
The cladding system on Grenfell was such that once it had caught fire, that building was going to go up, I think, like a tinderbox. But that didn't mean that the people in it had to die.
The Grenfell Tower fire was the worst peacetime residential fire in London for 100 years. An extraordinary number of events led to the disaster and subsequent high death toll. A public inquiry is underway, and much has been revealed about the dynamics of what went wrong that night. And yet hundreds of buildings are still at risk of a similar fire wherever private interests eat away at social housing to maximize profits at the cost of lives.
Fire Brigade?
Yeah, hello, hi, in the fire, flat 16 Grenfell Tower.
Sorry, a fire where?
Flat 16 Grenfell Tower.
Within 6 minutes of the call from the Ethiopian-born taxi driver in whose flat the fire began, the first responders were on the scene at the Grenfell Tower residential block in the London borough of Kensington and Chelsea. They thought they had put out the fire, But as these thermal images show, burning material was dripping from the cladding panel outside the window. To the surprise of the firemen on scene, the fire swept upwards from flat 16 to the roof of the tower in a mere 20 minutes, trapping hundreds of people in this remodeled relic of the 1970s. Antonio Roncolato was in his flat on the 10th floor when he was awoken at about 1:30 a.m. by a text from his son.
At around 1:40, Christopher, my son, came back from his work. After he finished work, he went for a couple of drinks, and then he came back by car, by minicab. So, and on the way back, he got a phone call from one of his cousins telling him that Grenfell Tower is burning. I'm sorry. Yeah, the Grenfell Tower was ablaze, and he could not. He said, "What are you talking about?" So basically, he reached the foot of Grenfell Tower, and straight away he called me and he told me, "Father, get out of there because the tower is burning." And basically, I was asleep. I was deep asleep, and so I answered the phone and I said, "What are you talking about, Christopher?"
More firemen rushed to the scene and began attacking the fire from the outside. But after initially spreading vertically on the east face to the roof, it then spread horizontally when the cladding lining on the crown architectural detail burned and melted down around the top of the building, allowing fire to then start spreading downward on the other three faces as well.
A few minutes after, Christopher sent me a photo, and I've got it on my phone. And he said, "You see, I sent you a photo, did you see it? The tower is really burning." So, and the tower, at that stage, 140, 145, was already, the east side of the tower was already, the left east side of the tower was already ablaze all the way up to the last floor.
The apartments filled with dark, toxic smoke as flames crept in through vents and cracks in the window framing. Later, fire roared into the apartments after the heat of the blaze simply burst through windows.
I got ready, I dressed up, I put together my some important documents, my phone, laptop in a rucksack in order to say, "No, I'm going out," you know. So, and I put a cap and everything, so then I said, "Okay, let me assess, you know, what the situation is like. In the stairway, in the hallway, you know." So I touched my front door, and it was very warm. And as I opened, a lot of I could see nothing. It was totally pitch black. The smoke the big puff of smoke that came in was so strong that made me close the door straight away. It was very hot, very strong. It was like if you're hit by a gas that you cannot breathe anymore.
Fire! On the other side of the building, many residents still had no idea of the disaster unfolding. When they found out, many chose to follow the fire brigade's protocol and stayed put, as emergency dispatchers instructed them and as notices posted on each floor advised.
So Christopher kept on calling me, and then he passed me on to the fire marshal. And I said, "Look, I'm on the 10th floor." I explained to them where I was located. And I said, "I'm on the 10th floor. I cannot go outside. It's very dangerous. There is a lot of smoke. It's almost impossible. So I need help to get out of here." I said, "Okay, mate, stay put. We know you're there. Somebody's coming to get you."
I'll have a look.
250 firemen were deployed during the emergency. What greeted them was nothing they had ever seen. More was going wrong than they could handle in one night.
At one stage, around 2:30, it was still very dark outside. I realized that there is smoke coming in from the ledges of the windows. Brand new windows just installed a year and a half before. So basically, I could see puffs of smoke coming in. And when I saw it, I could not believe it. And I said, "My God, what is going on?" there should be no smoke coming in. There should be no air. It should be airtight, this place. And it wasn't. So I went to the bathroom. I went to the, I grabbed clothes, towels and bed linen, whatever I had. I went to the bathroom and I put everything in the bathtub, make everything wet. And when because I wanted to put around the window ledges in order to stop the smoke from coming in. But when I came back, the flat was, the living room especially, was totally filled up with grey smoke.
Over the next 6 hours, the inferno killed 72 people, some of London's most vulnerable citizens, victims of dozens of failures in Britain's social housing policies and of a political class that ignored dire warnings of catastrophe on the horizon.
Still trapped inside their flat.
Jumped up while on the flat.
The fire in apartment 16 on the 4th floor on the eastern side of Grenfell Tower spread to the outside, and within 20 minutes, the flames had reached the 23rd floor. And were burning and melting the cladded architectural crown detail installed during renovation to make it look more attractive. Today, the blackened, hollow shell of Grenfell Tower is masked in white plastic sheeting, a grim monument to decades of urban planning failures. The Grenfell Tower stands in the northwest corner of the Kensington and Chelsea borough of London, on the Lancaster West estate. It was owned by the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, the richest in England, but was managed by the privately owned Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, or KCTMO. In this highly priced West London borough, the average selling price of a home is nearly £1 million. These subsidised dwellings stood on some of the most prized land in the UK. They were home to a happy, multi-ethnic community of families and professionals.
Right next to Grenfell Tower, we would have no major big buildings in there. So basically, the view that you would have from there, it would be totally free and totally, beautiful. My flat was facing east and south, so basically I could see the city from my flat, and on a clear day like today, you could really see very, very far away.
Bramley House is the closest residential building to Grenfell Tower, just across the railway line. It is home to Samia Badani, co-chair of the North Kensington Community Association.
I remember vividly a former resident of Grenfell Tower was at work. My daughter was in a playground because at the bottom of Grenfell Tower there was a playground, and we were all our children went to that Grenfell playground. And my daughter was with her and her daughter, and my daughter fell, and then I got a call from her. I didn't know because my daughter was late, and she told me, don't worry, she's like my daughter, I'm looking after her. It was that sense of human warmth, and these were the residents of Grenfell Tower. Like this, we have a Grenfell community. They were such a big part of the makeup of this neighborhood.
So many people from all over, from North Africa, from sub-Saharan part of the continent, from Portugal, from Spain, from Colombia, South America, lots of Indian people, Bangladeshi, and so on. So basically, it was really a mixed community, and and we, I was quite, very happy living in there. 27 years of my life, so it's a big chunk of my life.
Grenfell Tower was built in 1974 and contained 120 flats, housing between 400 and 600 people, like a small vertical village. 3 finger-like buildings extended from the second floor mezzanine, the ground and first floor being a hallway with a shopping level. The walls were built to withstand a fire for about an hour and to contain any fire internally. Geraldine Denning lives in another tower block in South London and is the lead architect of Architects for Social Housing, and has followed the unfolding housing crisis in London for decades.
If a fire takes place in one compartment, the compartmentation means that that fire is not allowed to spread to another one. So in a typical tower block like Grenfell Tower, each flat would be a complete compartment, and that would be the walls and the floors and the ceilings. So of course that relies upon the fire protection between compartments. So there's always things which pass through walls and floors. So services, doors and windows, things that break the compartment. So those are obviously the key points where you have to ensure that even if the compartmentation, the strategy is adequate and sufficient and perfectly and a good strategy, everything, all those other little details also have to support that strategy.
The building's original design had fireproofing systems to protect the residents, including a protected central hallway and stairwell equipped with extractor fans and emergency lighting.
The central circulation, the central core of Grenfell, has only one stair. That was traditional and still is current practice in the UK. Because the fire stair isn't deemed in a building which is compartmentalised like that, the stair isn't used for escape, or rather not for emergency evacuation. I think that's a very important thing to consider. So when you have a building which is compartmentalised like this, the general rule is to stay put. So the idea is that if you have a fire in your compartment, the idea is to restrain the fire within that compartment.
Little more than 30 years after the tower was built, the local council began exploring ways of cashing in on the value of this prized stretch of land between Ladbroke Grove and Latimer Road tube stations. Simon Elmer co-directs the association and is the co-author of the first publicly available report on the Grenfell Tower disaster.
Sometime in the early 2000s, the Lancaster West Estate, which is what Grenfell Tower sits on, and the neighbouring estate, the Silchester Estate, and some of the other area around it, there was a kind of an entire area plan, was put up for regeneration. It's a poor area of Kensington Chelsea, which is one of the richest boroughs, probably the richest borough in the UK. They did this in the middle of the financial crash, and in which, in 2007, after that, house prices in London fell for the first time since, kind of like the late 70s or something. So they came up with a revised plan. This is the council, Kensington Chelsea Council, which was to demolish the Silchester Estate still, but to refurbish the Lancaster West Estate, including Grenfell Tower.
A few years before Grenfell, an area in this neighbourhood was earmarked, chosen for regeneration. But in local authority language, regeneration means knocking down buildings. It means us losing our homes. Doesn't mean reviving the area.
If they were going to start building new developments, new properties around there, residential properties, for anything between, in that area, certainly over £1 million, maybe £750,000. People are not going to pay for those properties when they're looking across at a post-war 70s concrete council estate.
Michael Jardine is a local activist and architect who lives on the Silchester estate and opposed the controversial Notting Barns master plan.
The Notting Barns master plan was a regeneration of both estates on a loose principle that, they were at the end of their life or were perceived to have antisocial behaviour, or that the council fundamentally didn't like them and didn't see why they had to pay to maintain them, when the brand of Kensington and Chelsea could be projected into this area.
One of the most hotly contested issues was the construction of a privately owned sixth form academy.
In front of the Grenfell Tower, that is as part of the Lancaster West Estate, there was a large car park and a series of gardens, which were used by the local residents. The principle of building high tower blocks in the 70s was to actually free up the land around it for recreational use and all sorts of other ideas. What the council came to a decision was to sell that land for the building of a private academy school. The idea behind this, which is used on almost every council estate regeneration scheme, is what's called cross-subsidisation. You privatise part of the land, or you use council land to build market sale developments on it, residences, and then you use the profits from that to subsidise the building of whatever, council housing, affordable housing, or to refurbish council estates that you're not going to demolish.
We used to have 3 football pitches and then a massive car park. And then on the side you would have also a road that would go right next to the tower. Okay, which makes sense. You know, you have access to the tower in case of. They said, okay, we're going to use this space because we need to build an academy in there, we need to build a school, but we're going to refurbish the tower. The tower now is standing right in a cul-de-sac, having access only from a small road, which is called Grenfell Road, with cars parked on each side. And they said, we are trapped in here.
Aesthetically, I think the cladding was originally specified by the architects of the academy to make a whole piece of the academy and the tower.
In 2012, the local council put the tower block refurbishment to tender and eventually opted for a low-cost cladding proposal aimed at improving heat efficiency and beautifying the concrete high-rise.
When you understand the way that a building, a fire system works, it's not just the individual materials, but it's also the way they work together. So what we most likely understand was that there was a piece of some kind of timber, whether it's an oriented OSB board or a ply board that was installed on the surface of the concrete. Onto that you'd have your insulation, and onto that was the aluminium support for the cladding and then the cladding itself. And it was the way in which all those different pieces of the structure worked together, which is what created the inferno.
They filled up the gaps between the concrete and this sheet of aluminium, whatever it was, that was totally flammable. And inside they put some insulation material, yeah? But also in there, they put a lot of rubbish that came from the buildings. Instead of taking it down, they would, stuff it in there. It's like putting dust under the carpet. Nobody will see it.
Given the complaints that were coming from the residents at every stage of the construction and the refurbishment of the building, the complaints of the standard of the installation, there's nothing left of the tower now to know, but in terms of it's highly likely that the standard of installation of some of these things means that a lot of the fire collars, for example, may not have been installed correctly. A lot of the intumescent strips, a lot of the fire protection strategies may well have not been installed adequately correctly. That's highly likely, given what the residents had already said.
Starting in 2012, Grenfell Tower was refurbished with a new external insulation and overcladding system, new windows and window frames with extractor fans. Refurbishment was completed in 2016 at a cost of £8.6 million, £2.5 million less than the original budget. Poor maintenance and non-compliance of some of the refurbishment materials turned a small fire into a catastrophe. The cladding itself, called Celotex, consisted of sheets of polysocyanurate glued to a plywood backing attached to the outer concrete surface of the building. This surface was protected by a Rainobond rain shield made of a sandwich of 6 mm of polyethylene between 2 0.5 mm thick aluminium sheets. The original KCTMO project promised zinc outer panels with a higher fire resistance. Expert witnesses testified that cladding panels did not comply with the more rigorous standards for insulating materials on high-rise dwellings. Rather, they only complied with less rigorous specifications for outer surface building materials, even though these panels contained a highly flammable polyethylene core. According to expert reports, the hasty assembly of the cladding also left exposed polyethylene edges and removed fire-stopping mechanisms, especially along the columns running up the building. However, these were not the only factors that killed 72 people that night. Over and beyond the disastrous rain cladding, there were also weatherproofing rubber membranes, spray foam, PVC windows, silicone sealant, glues, and polystyrene window fill panels. All of these highly combustible materials were interconnected by air-filled cavities that allowed the fire to race up, down, and horizontally across the exterior of Grenfell Tower.
The cladding would have added a good 20 or 30 centimetres, 20 or 25 centimetres to the surface of the building. That's to include 150 millimetres of insulation. So you suddenly have the space within this cavity and the insulation itself, which can then pass up through the window frames, essentially, into the interior of the building. And so that becomes a very, very fragile part in the building envelope.
The fact is that the window should have been totally sealed off, airtight. Windows and ledges and frames, whatever you want to call them, and they were not. And that's what caused the smoke. That's what was, when you see smoke coming in and it doesn't go out, and what you do, So it's the smoke that kills, it's not the fire itself. And I've got the picture in there of the little puffs of smoke coming in.
There should be fire stopping measures which would go around all the openings and at various stages on each floor, essentially, which would prevent exactly what we saw happening. So it leads us to conclude that those fire stopping measures weren't in place.
By 1:30 a.m., the fire was out of control, but dispatchers continued to tell residents to stay put. 10 residents died trying to go down the stairs. Many were discouraged by the smoke and went upwards, but there was no way onto the roof.
I could see people waving, people calling for help, children screaming. I saw a woman at a window and she just burst into flames. It's just like a gush of fire. We felt their pain. And I think, I don't know how to explain that, but we knew they were going to die. And there's nothing we could do. They were trapped. It was an inferno.
Families with children could be seen waving from their apartments or flashing the lights on and off. At least 4 victims died after having jumped from their burning apartments. The fire brigade was forced by smoke and heat in the only central stairwell to move its command post to the bottom of the building. Rescue teams were sent to save people trapped in their apartments. The lifts did not comply with fire safety rules and were unavailable for firefighters to use. Some of the apartments had also been renumbered, and some had no numbers on their doors at all. In other cases, the stranded victims had moved to their neighbours or further up the building to the very top, where firefighters had trouble reaching them. At 2:35 a.m., the fire brigade told dispatchers that stay put was no longer an option, and residents should try to get out if possible. It was too late. 114 were still inside. Only 42 made it out alive.
The second time that I tried to get out, to try to see if I could go down, if the smoke in the hallway would be a bit better, a bit clearer, it was even worse. And what put me off as well was the second time when I tried to get out was that noises was coming. I could hear some noises and people screaming. So it was really discouraging, you know, to try to go out and to do something stupid.
By 3 a.m, the fire in the Grenfell Tower had spread up the vertical columns, then horizontally around the crown, and then back down in other directions, and then, like a macabre Christmas tree, spread sideways into the apartments, one by one. These incredible infrared images from the Metropolitan Police helicopter show how the flames spread around the building. The flames spread relentlessly through air cavities, fueled by the polyethylene sandwich, melting the plastics, polycyanurate panels and aluminium debris, eventually setting the panels on fire. An unbearable stench filled the area.
And there were gas explosions, and it felt like the tower was moving sideways, and we were quite terrified that it would collapse. We were pretty much on our own. I think we felt really unsafe. There were burning debris coming to our courtyards. It was terrible. I could, at some point, I needed to go through the police cordon, and the police officer told me, "You can go, but it's at your own peril." And I went, and I saw my neighbours in shock, sheer shock.
Daniela Fetkansou is a preacher of the nearby Notting Hill Methodist Church, where much of the community assembled during the fire.
You could hear the most horrific screams, and it got to a stage anyway where we were told we had to leave because of the debris that was coming from the buildings. Don't know what they were, but they could harm us, and the fumes and that sort of thing. And the community, the people, the shock on their faces.
The rescue efforts were tireless, but slow and ineffective. Bodycam footage worn by a fire chief recorded him begging for an accurate set of floor plans from the KCTMO.
As far as I'm aware, the guy from the TMO, the MD from the TMO, has got plans on his phone, and he was looking to ping them through to somebody. So,
for what it's worth, I've got a picture from the BA control of the layout of a standard floor, but also we know which numbers the flats are.
Sending it on a phone is no good for me. So, and I hate to say this, and please don't record this in the minutes, but having experienced the back end of the Lacanau inquiry, having been in charge of other major incidents, I'm telling you now that the fact you have not been able to get me a set of plans, actually as a set of plans, is a major deficiency.
5:30, just before my last conversation with Christopher, I saw the fire crawling down on the cladding on the outside of my son's window. So I saw, and when I saw the fire, I said, bloody hell! Now the fire is, that's when I got a bit more nervous. But the fact is that then the firefighters from the high ladder, they sprayed a lot of water, and then they put off the fire, and they sprayed a lot of water into my and Christopher's bedroom as well. Through only the windows were closed, but there was a little vent at the top that was open, and through that vent, a lot of water came through. But I was happy to see the water.
More had gone wrong than anyone would have imagined.
If that fire hadn't started, none of this would have happened. The next thing went wrong was that as soon as the fire was able to get outside of the building, there's a debate as to whether or not the construction of the windows, so the refurbishment of the windows, the new position of the windows was outside of the original frame of the building. The reality was it was a very hot night, and the chances were everybody's windows would have been open at that point. The new material, which was placed onto the building, did transmit the flame across its surface. One of the key mechanisms for that spread of flame was what could be understood as a series of chimneys. There were gaps which moved up through the building to enable the draft of air to pull the flames vertically up the building.
The cladding system on Grenfell was such that once it had caught fire, that building was going to go up, I think, like a tinderbox. But that didn't mean that the people in it had to die. The residents had been complaining about the poor quality of the renovation of the interior, which involved lots of fire safety measures, the securing of the compartmentalisation of it, the fact that the smoke extractors didn't work, the fact that the emergency lighting in the stairwell didn't work, the fact that, as they reported, gas mains unboxed ran down the fire stairway, which is kind of the extent of the lunacy of the refurbishment of that.
Antonio Roncolato was still alive.
Around 5:30, 6 o'clock, I had the last conversation with Christopher, and I said, Christopher, listen, I've been here for so long. They told me that they would come and get me. They told me to stay put, even though I cannot go out. And I said, I need you to, I need to speak to someone to see really what's happening. And he ran right next to the tower, and then he passed, one fire marshal or fire brigade man or something. And so I said, look, this is happening. I'm still here. You told me to stay put. And I tried twice to go out, and the smoke is horrible. So then this guy told me, it was around 6 o'clock, he told me, okay, mate, wait a second, literally like that, wait a second. So then I could hear that he was talking to someone else. He talked to 2 firemen, and then he said, okay, be prepared because somebody's coming to you now.
Others were talking to people trapped on the inside. Several broadcast on Facebook Live and used other social media to communicate their last desperate feelings to the world. The thoughts of those who survived went to those still trapped. At last, Antonio Roncolato was able to escape.
I got ready, and then a few minutes after, 6 o'clock, 2 firefighters came in to my flat. They knocked, they banged at the door. I opened straight away, and they told me, how many of you? I said, there's only me. Right, we're going to do the following. I'm going to be in the front. You are going to be in the middle, behind me. You grab me from my jacket at the back, and my colleague is going to be in the back of you, and he will guide you through as well. So, and they said, are you ready? I said, yes. He took my hat off, and he put a wet towel that he found on the floor. He put it over me. I had a wet towel, small wet towel on my mouth, so to protect my breathing, basically. And on the way down, I stepped over a dead body, and I couldn't move any further down. So the guy behind me, he lifted my right foot, and he freed me, and then we moved on.
By failing to properly assess fire danger in the refurbished, cladded Grenfell Tower, London had failed its most vulnerable citizens, many of whom were foreigners or of non-British descent. Entire families died in the Grenfell Tower fire, huddled together in their flats or fleeing down the stairwell. The nation mourned 72 dead from all over the world. Antonio Roncolato survived.
I was the one, like, don't worry, I'm here, I'm fine, everything is okay, I got out, But it was extremely, extremely stressful. And mainly for Christopher, because Christopher was outside the tower, watching the beast burning and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Me inside, and even though I was trying to, because I had to reassure him that I was okay, that this is not my day, that I will make it, that everything's gonna be fine, that we're gonna be together again. But he was not sure.
In 2009, rain cladding on another council building, Lakanal House in southern London, caught fire. 6 people died.
After the Lakanal House fire in 2009, the coroner took about 3 years to write this report, and it made a series of recommendations. One of the key ones was that not the cause of the fire, but the virulence of the fire, how a small fire managed to kill 6 people and spread up so quickly, was that it used aluminium composite rain cladding. And this is the form that's used similar form to used on the Grenfell Tower fire.
If sprinklers had been installed, the fire would not have spread to the outer, flammable surface of the building. But sprinkler systems are not required by law to be retrofitted onto older buildings in Britain.
The all-party parliamentary fire safety and rescue group which is composed of, I guess, the most senior fire experts in the country, sent letters urging 4 subsequent ministers, 2 ministers and 2 under-ministers, in the Department of Communities and Local Government to pass legislation for the retrofitting of sprinklers to residential dwellings. And this urging was sat on by subsequent ministers over a very long time.
The type of cladding used in the Grenfell Tower is banned in Germany and in the USA on high-rise buildings above 18 metres. Building regulations in Britain require external surfaces do not spread fire, but do not take into account the possibility of fire spreading via exposed flammable edges. After a similar fire in Australia, a senior fire safety engineer testified that 1 kilo of polyethylene is equivalent to 5.5 litres of petrol.
What was produced was a kind of cocktail. Within that panel, it's possible to add certain additives which might have sort of mineralized that, which I think potentially would have reduced the fire, the flammability of that material. As far as I'm aware, they didn't use those panels. But yeah, I mean, the speed at which it went up the building, I'd say yes, pretty much was petrol. If you'd seen the flames and the footage filmed from all those people's mobile phone cameras, then yeah, that was like igniting petrol on a building, yeah.
London is one of the richest cities in the world, and land is extremely valuable. The local boroughs stand to make a fortune from selling the land to developers who promise that a certain number of social homes will be retained. This rarely happens.
About 20 years ago, probably a little bit longer, there was what we're in the middle of now, or 20 odd years into, which is a national program called the Estate Regeneration Program. In London, it almost always means, regeneration always means demolition and redevelopment. That's because the Estate Regeneration Program in its current form is not about refurbishing homes, but of getting access to the land that these council estates are built on.
Many Grenfell residents are still without permanent housing. They are eager to see justice done and the truth about what went wrong that night come out in the ongoing inquiry. They have publicly defended members of the fire brigades, who some see as scapegoats for a much bigger problem. Local MP Emma Dent-Coad joined a march in support of the men and women who risked their lives battling the Grenfell Tower fire.
There's been no change at the council. This could happen again tomorrow. If this has happened to their neighbours, they would have dealt with it. And I genuinely think there's a really horrible and unforgivable undercurrent of racism there. They may not even be aware of it themselves, but they do think that people in the tower are lesser beings, and I've seen that many, many times. I'm on the Fire Safety and Rescue Committee in Parliament, and we're constantly making recommendations. We have the Fire Minister in, ask him questions. He doesn't know what he's doing, and he's very offhand about it. It's really, this could happen again tomorrow.
As the flames were eating through the Grenfell Tower, this multi-ethnic community came together. In what was a makeshift emergency shelter under the overpass, survivors have since posted their personal stories, memories, and calls for justice. Children put up drawings of the night. People of different faiths came together to help their fellow neighbours.
I remember there are lots of people crying, saying, I can't find my cousin, I can't find my daughter, I can't find this. And it got to a situation where we say, what do they look like? Photographs and that sort of thing. We had the Notting Hill van outside, and they started putting pictures of, the missing people on there. And that sort of like grew, really, and then it was on the railings, and then it was on the walls, and then it was just all around the community. Because people were just saying, have you seen this person? because people were obviously running to all sorts of areas and and some people were not actually in at the time, so there were lots of people who were looking for their family members.
The anger that still simmers under the ashes of the gutted Grenfell Tower is fueling a new civic movement of solidarity and self-governance that may one day be the cornerstone of a new community.
I think what the tragedy did, it highlighted that stigma. I would call it stigma because it's not just race or faith, it's social status somehow. It's like living in social housing is a bad thing, that we can't be educated people or we don't have a career. And when you look at the makeup of the local area, people are working, people are, have degrees. And it's like no matter what we do in our life, no matter how high we reach in our life, we're still labeled as low-class people.
More than 2 years after 72 people died in the Grenfell Tower fire, the inquiry has yet to determine officially what went wrong. But resilient residents have Grenfell in their hearts and are not about to let the country forget.
Any local authority would have lost its right to make decisions for people it serves. But this local authority continued to do so while it was still under a question mark as to its fitness to exercise their duty of care. They are under criminal investigation for potential breaches of health and safety regulations. Why should we trust them? Why should we go to them? So it created a vacuum, and that vacuum was filled by the community. Hence we set up the space here, because either you bring government to take over, or you bring commissioners to take over, or the community to take over.
The Lancaster estate residents plan to keep pushing for justice, calling for public and private sector accountability and lobbying for policy changes that will help prevent any such tragedy from happening again. Only if the lessons of the Grenfell Tower fire are learned and real changes arise from the inquiry will the deaths of their friends, family and neighbours not have been in vain. On June 3rd, 1998, a high-speed Deutsche Bahn train travelling at nearly 200 kilometers per hour derailed and crashed into a road bridge near the village of Eschede in northern Germany, killing 101 and injuring 100. It was the worst rail disaster in the history of Germany and the most catastrophic high-speed train crash ever recorded. What went wrong with Intercity Express, or ICE 884, Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen, as it hurtled along its route between Munich and Hamburg? Incredibly, the disaster was set in motion by a single, tiny fatigue crack. The crack unravelled the outer rim of a bogie, pushing the carriage off the tracks and against the pylons of a road bridge, causing it to collapse. The remaining train cars crashed into the wreckage, folding up on each other accordion style. In 3.5 seconds, the high-speed train came to a catastrophic halt. Only a lucky few survived.
I had the same grave kind of injuries as the dead. I was really lucky that I was not among the dead, as I had the same serious injuries as the dead.
Hier hatten wir dann plötzlich ganz viele Tote und wenn man da...
There were so many dead. And when you have to come to terms with that, there were children, adults, the elderly. It was disturbing beyond anything I had ever known before.
Die ich vorher auch gar nicht gekannt habe.
The inquiry lasted 53 days and led to manslaughter charges for at least 2 Deutsche Bahn employees. The accident eventually changed train safety and improved emergency response procedures in Germany, but left a nation shocked. Bavaria. It is early on the morning of June the 3rd, 1998, and commuters and families are boarding trains in the Munich Hauptbahnhof, headed north for business and pleasure. The ICE 884 Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen is headed to Hamburg, with scheduled stops in the picturesque cities of Augsburg, Nuremberg, Würzburg, Fulda, Kassel, Göttingen and Hanover. When the doors finally close and the train pulls out of the station, 287 passengers are on board, settling into their travel routines. Udo Bauch was on a business trip to Hamburg and boarded the ICE in Fulda. He knew the voyage would be fast and smooth, and he'd be able to get a little work done en route. He was sitting alone in first class, coach 11.
The weather was very nice that day. It was a summer day, and my trip started well. My wife brought me to the station, and I got on the train. I wanted to go to Hamburg that day. I knew, in any case, that day I wanted to work and was alone in the coach. I had my laptop with me because I wanted to work in peace and quiet, so I had no other passengers with me, and I had planned it that way, so I could work in peace.
About 130 kilometers south of Hamburg, with only 40 minutes left to the final destination, it quickly became clear there was something serious amiss in Coach 1. Unusual vibrations had been noticed by previous passengers, and now something even worse happened. A steel shaft shot through the armrest of Jörg Dittmann, a passenger in Coach 1. Rather than pull the emergency brake, he went to find a ticket collector, who told him it was company policy to investigate before stopping the train. All of a sudden, the rear coaches began travelling on a different set of rails, hurtling horizontally towards the bridge, slamming into it. The bridge collapsed onto the train, crushing the rear half of Coach 5. The restaurant coach, 6, was completely crushed to just 15 centimeters in height. There was no chance of survival for anyone dining in Coach 6 at the time of the accident. The remaining cars jackknifed into one another.
I looked up at the clock, and I was working on my laptop, and then all of a sudden there was a blow, an impact like nothing I had ever heard. And from then on, it all went very fast. Then, within the coach, I was thrown about, over and under, and from left to right. All sorts of chairs and train parts were flying against me, until I was just suddenly lying there, and I knew something terrible had happened. I thought 2 trains had collided.
I heard over the radio what was happening while on my way to Eschede. And then, as we neared Eschede, we were able to speak to the mayor, who was able to tell us that it's an ICE train, it's completely destroyed, and the bridge is also completely destroyed, and it all looks quite horrific. That was the first information I had.
Also schon auf dem Weg dahin war durch den Funkverkehr, den man ja...
We could hear the radio traffic as we were on our way to Eschede, but it was confused information, as the various frequencies and traffic were all over the place, and it was difficult to make out.
Genau auszumachen, aber es war alles völlig busy. Und als wir dann nach Eschede kamen und auch auf diesen Brückenkopf...
Then, as I came to Eschede and drove up to the top of where the bridge was, there lay the ICE train, totally destroyed. I had never seen anything like it. I was perplexed, as I was not at all trained for what lay before me.
War ich in dem Sinne auch gar nicht vorbereitet.
2 Deutsche Bahn railway technicians who had been doing maintenance near the bridge would be killed instantly when car number 4 came hurtling toward them at 200 kilometers per hour.
Der dritte Wagen
The back of the third wagon went onto a different rail, and then it derailed, and the back of the wagon hit the bridge pylon, and it began to collapse. The fourth wagon was able to come under the bridge, and then the bridge collapsed onto wagon 5, destroying it completely. Then the other wagons just piled up against the bridge.
Dann die anderen Wagen haben sich dann vor der Brücke zusammengeschoben.
The front power car, which had detached from the rest of the train, coasted for another 3 kilometers until coming to a stop just past Eschede railway station. Residents in the tiny town just 130 kilometers south of Hamburg had no idea what was happening just south of their normally quiet and tidy German village. Andreas Effinghausen was one of the first police officers to arrive at the bridge from Celle.
Und als wir dann dort ankamen,
As I came into town, I stopped the car and got out to go on foot, and that's when I saw that the bridge was completely down. So I went down along the embankment by the bridge, and I saw the train, and a whole wagon had been split open. And as I looked around, I thought, what am I going to do here? I just had no idea what to do next.
Und dann habe ich da erstmal gestanden und war völlig fassungslos. Ich wusste gar nicht, was ich machen sollte.
Once I came to this sudden halt and was lying there. I was totally pinned, and my leg was pinned, and I couldn't move. I could only cry out and hope that someone found me.
Es war allerdings nicht zu hören, es war absolute Ruhe.
You couldn't hear anything. There was complete silence, not a sound. So I went down around the train and I simply called out, "Hello?" And Udo Bauch answered me.
Udo Bauch mir geantwortete.
Hello, hello, is anyone there? He yelled. And I heard it, and I tried to pull myself up and say, yes, my name is Ugo Bauch, please help me.
The local fire chief, Gerd Backerberg, immediately began to organize the emergency response.
Ja,
The disaster site was about 500, 600 meters total, since the first 5 wagons had come under the bridge, and the others were all piled on top of each other along the track. One wagon was lying beneath the destroyed bridge, and all the others were folded up like an accordion in front of the bridge.
Eine Ziehharmonika vor der Brücke aufgetürmt dann.
An hour and a half later, the district government had declared a civil state of emergency. Immediately after the train derailment on June 3rd, 1998, more than 100 rescue workers from around the region were dispatched to the scene, and within hours, more than 1,800 personnel had arrived. Edvard Hüls was the emergency room physician on duty in the nearby city of Celle and immediately rushed to the disaster site to help.
The first thing I thought as I was standing there was, what am I even going to do here? It is a question one asks oneself. You suddenly understand what it means when you have an education as a nursing assistant, and then suddenly your skills are going to be needed in a way that you could never have ever predicted or imagined.
A nearby hall was turned into an emergency triage center and makeshift morgue, as rescuers feverishly tried to extract the living from the wreckage.
Weil der Zug in großen Teilen gar nicht eindringbar war.
The train was impenetrable due to the windows and the doors. This was a basic problem we had from the very beginning. And as a result, we could only treat the patients who we could get to in the very last wagons, put onto stretchers, and then begin doing triage that was needed.
Und eben dann auch behandeln kann.
Wir haben es zum Schluss aufgegeben. Es war nicht möglich.
We eventually gave up trying to make holes big enough in the doors and windows to get the patients out to be treated. At that point, the fire department helped us, And since the last 6 wagons were all lying next to each other, we were able to access the coaches through the aisles, cutting out the seats as we went through and slowly working from the back toward the front. But it was very difficult.
Von hinten langsam weiter nach vorne gearbeitet, aber es war sehr, sehr aufwendig.
Utter devastation was everywhere. For 20 minutes, rescuers stepped gingerly around live railway electrical cables carrying 15,000 volts. The train cars were horribly mangled, and rescuers struggled to reach the dozens of wounded and dying inside due to the impenetrable windows and doors.
Ja, die Verletzten aus den Waggons.
It was very difficult to get the wounded out of the train, but we were able to get to those we could reach quickly, and by 1400 hours, we had finished that part of the rescue. Between 14 and 1430, we had all the wounded people rescued and transported to nearby clinics or hospitals. It actually had gone fairly quickly. What had gone wrong with this train, the pride of Germany's railways? The first clue was that part of the railway line had penetrated the floor of carriage 1. Something had literally lifted the train off the track, and it could only have been a defective wheel. The first high-speed train debuted in Japan in 1965, but Germany was not far behind, adopting high-speed train travel with its intercity rail system in 1971. Germany's upgraded high-speed ICE train service was launched to great fanfare in June 1991. They had speed up to 280 kilometers per hour, safety, comfort, and state-of-the-art engineering. Not surprisingly, the fast and comfortable trains with amenities like dining cars, telephone service, and entertainment made the trains popular from the outset.
This train was the flagship of the German fleet. It was important that it was seen to be operating properly and providing comfortable service for passengers. And it soon became apparent, though, there was a lot of transmission of noise and vibration into the carriages, particularly the restaurant cars and the other carriages. It was decided to try and solve this problem by introducing these rather peculiar wheels which had a separate rim separated from the hub by rubber pads.
Germany's ICE trains were originally equipped with single-cast wheel sets, known as monoblock wheels, a design that engineers realized suffered from metal fatigue that caused vibration at cruising speed. They were, in essence, a legacy design. However, Deutsche Bahn exchanged them for new wheels based on streetcar wheels used on trams.
These wheels had been used very successfully in a lot of low-speed applications in tram systems. I think Hanover was one of the cities. There were others too that used them. And so they had some sort of pedigree, but they'd never been used for high-speed operations. They were successful in cutting down noise transmission, and so they proved to be in the ICE trains for a considerable time. So things looked as if the problem had been solved.
The new and improved ICE wheel tyre design consisted of a wheel body surrounded by a 20mm thick rubber damper and then a relatively thin metal rim. This successfully reduced the vibration at cruising speeds, but few tests were done on how the new rim design would hold up to the wear and tear of high-speed operation.
That is, a wear process takes place, and the shape of the wheel conforms more and more to the rounded shape of the rail head, which leads to unsatisfactory running of the train. So periodically the wheels are reprofiled after quite long periods of time. In these rimmed wheels, where the rim was separate from the hub of of the wheel. This continual reprofiling reduced the thickness of the rim. And so the bending that took place every time the wheel rotated between the separate rim and the solid hub, separated by these rubber pads, grew greater because the rim became more flexible.
The Fraunhofer Institute for Structural Durability and System Reliability in Darmstadt presented 300 pages of expert testimony at the trial. They found that a cracking inside the rim of the wheel caused by excessive load and wear was responsible for the accident. Professor Roderick Smith is one of the engineers called in to find out what went wrong.
When the wheels were examined for cracks, in a normal solid wheel, one examines the outer tread of the wheel, where the cracks are likely to form between the wheel and the rail. On this occasion, nobody was examining the inside of the wheel, and so the crack remained undetected in inspections because it wasn't being looked for.
Engineers found that the rims became flattened into an elliptical shape as the wheel turned. Cracks could also form on the inside of this type of tyre, which was never tested in the entire 4 years it was in operation. But could regular maintenance have detected the worn-out rims? Many warning signs went unheeded. The world had never seen a high-speed rail crash of such epic, tragic proportions. The mangled cars of the ICE 884 train Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen, en route from Munich to Hamburg, had not only derailed, but also hit an overpass, causing it to collapse onto the second half of the train, which then piled up in a zigzag motion. The biggest challenge at first was knowing the scale of the disaster. Just how many people had boarded the train?
Dieser ICE hatte ja eine Sitzplatzkapazität von 709.
The ICE had a seating capacity of 795 seats. The emergency manager of the Deutsche Bahn came to the town and told us, "It's not like an airplane when you have assigned seats and check in and you can tell who is present or not, but rather people buy a ticket from point A to B, and whether or not they are on the train or decide to take another one, you do not know. But," he said, "based on this time of year, this time of the week, it was a Wednesday, and based on the time of day, that on the train they estimated there were approximately 200 to 300 people. And indeed, that proved to be correct."
Und das hat sich dann nachher auch bestätigt.
By 2 p.m., they had a full picture of what they faced. 124 injured, more than 80 of them seriously. 16 had walked away, and 101 dead and dying in the impenetrable or crushed train cars.
Also unverletzte oder leicht verletzte Personen.
Lightly wounded or those without injuries were in the first 3 wagons. In the 4th wagon were more gravely wounded, but after the 5th wagon, it was mostly just dead.
Wagen 5 waren dann Tote zu beklagen.
Lying in pain, pinned beneath parts of his coach, Udo Bauch saw his life flash before his eyes.
And then you see these near-death images that flash through your head. From your childhood, your youth, when you become a parent, the night you met your wife, the whole life ran through my head, and I knew either I am going to die or somehow I will come out of this. And then, at a certain point, I heard the voice of my rescuer, Andrea, a policeman from Celle, who I am still friends with today. And I was a bit more reassured that someone had found me.
Hat mich dann gebeten, seine Frau zu verständigen.
He begged me to contact his wife. He gave me names and a phone number and asked me to call. I asked him about his injuries and he said that he thought that his entire left side must be broken. He was in a lot of pain, so I told him I would go and get a doctor. and we would try to get him out as fast as possible.
Retter ranhole, dass wir ihn da rausbekommen.
My wife had to search for me. She had brought me to the train platform and then gone home and heard about the derailment. Then she noted the train's name, Wilhelm König Röntgen. She heard it on the television and she thought, that is the train. My husband is inside. Then she made contact with the authorities, who gave her a long list of hospitals where the various patients were. And she had to call and call. But the answer everywhere was negative. And then the next to the last one was the hospital in Hanover. And there they had an unknown patient wearing blue pants, a wedding ring with the name Monica engraved into it, and was approximately 30 years old. And it was with this glimmer of hope that she went to Hanover to search for me.
Udo's rescuer, Andreas Effinghausen, also went to see him at the hospital. He was met by Monica, relieved to have finally found her husband and be at his side.
Ja, also sie hat mich erstmal ganz herzlich begrüßt.
First, she warmly said hello to me, and then we went up to intensive care to see Udo. He wasn't totally conscious, he was still in a medically induced coma. But later he told me he could hear my voice.
Gehört, dass ich da war, also er hat die Stimme gehört, aber er konnte ihm halt noch nicht antworten.
ER physician Dr. Edvard Hüls was confronted with the most difficult choice a doctor can face.
To be in a situation where so many patients need your help. They were all trying to talk to me and say, we need a doctor. And I had my kit with me so they could recognize me as a real doctor from afar. And they all thought, oh, he will come right away. Yet he is not coming over to me. It is not something you can train for. Getting through those very difficult moments and decisions was very hard. I couldn't care for some of the patients, even when I knew things were going quite badly for them.
Also ich sag mal, das war eigentlich das Schlimmste.
It was one of the worst experiences I've ever had. I've seen many road accidents, and I've seen many injured people as a policeman. But so many people, such a massive accident scene. This was almost impossible for me. It took a long time for me to get my head around all that had happened. For that reason, still today, I remember every detail. I'll never forget it.
Ich weiß heute noch genau jedes Detail, also ich werde das auch nicht vergessen.
The accident took 6 days to clear so that trains could resume running on the busy Munich to Hamburg line.
Wir haben tatsächlich bei einer Lagefeststellung nachmittags 15 Uhr.
At a certain rescue site, we, at a certain point at 1500 hours, reported that we had 1,250 vehicles working directly on site.
Dort waren rund 350.
There had been a total of 1,800 vehicles, including 350 trucks that were attached to various entities, as well as 39 aircraft, which was the biggest air response in the history of the German Republic since the war.
Insgesamt in diesem Einsatz 39 Luftfahrzeuge eingebunden gewesen.
Forensic teams began the grim task of collecting body parts in small grey trays. Entire families were wiped out in 3.5 seconds. The train had started in southern Germany, and there were many, many families, especially children with their mothers on their way to the North Sea, and in the end we had more than 30 dead children. But it could have been even worse. Another high-speed train had just passed under the very same bridge. Udo Bauch was disabled.
I had third-degree head injuries, jaw fractured in 4 places, skull fractures, and my left leg was broken. I had multiple fractures. Everything was broken. I had the same grave injuries as the dead. And I was really lucky not to be among the dead, because I had many of the same injuries as the dead.
The extent of grief in the tiny village was overwhelming. a special trauma team moved into the back of the small hall that had been turned into triage centre and morgue. The psychological support team would remain in place for over a year at a centre erected in the nearby city of Celle, and eventually become a model for trauma counselling and disaster response in Germany. Through the police and the border patrol, we brought in psychological teams and cared for the wounded, the relatives who were arriving, and also later on, also the rescuers who were on site. Later, a counseling center was erected in the nearby town of Celle with a pastor, a psychologist, and a typist who worked alongside them. And this center was in service for over a year and a half. The accident happened in a matter of seconds, but the catastrophe was actually set in motion by one wholly preventable failure: a tiny fatigue crack in the steel tire on a wheel of the third axle of the first car.
Suddenly the rim fractured and sort of spread itself out like a spear and came up through the seat of one of the passengers was sitting there, and it came up through his seat and caused considerable concern, of course. The passenger rushed to the guard, who was several carriages away from him, to tell him what had happened and to stop the train. Apparently the guard was rather slow in reacting, but started walking with the passenger back to the site of the damage. But before they could get there, the trailing end of the rim caught on a set of points below the train and derailed one of the bogies of the carriage that the train was on.
So what went wrong? 3 separate automated checks indicated a defect in the ICE train's wheels. The train's onboard computer also showed that conductors and other train staff had filed 8 separate complaints about noises and other vibrations being generated by the defective wheel, yet the company did not replace it. The train conductor also failed to stop the train in time.
Of course, it's relatively easy to run computer models, quite complicated computer models, but the question is, are we modelling the right thing? And that can only be answered by testing. And here the structure was so different from the conventional wheel that testing would have revealed the difference in the structure and the different location of where the cracks were going to form. The fact that if a crack was going to initiate, it would be initiated on the inside of the rim, which normally is not a place you would look at because it would be part of a solid wheel. And the fact that the reprofiling process had not been rethought to accommodate the separate rim. I think these are actually very fundamental issues.
But while the disintegrated wheel might have been the root cause of the accident, the damage became catastrophic due to the proximity of the bridge and the position of the wheel on a car at the front end of the train, which led to such a large number of cars derailing.
If the train had been stopped immediately the accident would have happened, the disaster might have been avoided. And one of the ways in which that could have happened was if the driver had some indication that there was a major fault on one of the bogies. He actually had an indication of the level of the toilet water in each of the carriages, but not on the condition of the bogies.
The relathing of the wheels had created a microscopic crack on the inner surface of the outer rim that failed.
They examined carefully all the wheels on the similar trains. They found interestingly, that only the wheels that had been reprofiled, I think 6 times, had cracks inside, and of the population that had been reprofiled 6 times, I think 80% of them had little cracks there that could have grown quickly. Of the wheels that hadn't been reprofiled 6 times, but less times, they didn't find any cracks. So clearly, the limit of the reprofiling had been exceeded, and it caused them to rethink the whole business, and they went back to running on solid wheels.
The snapped rim shot into the seat in carriage 1, but also hooked a set of points on the railway line that pushed the following carriage onto a parallel set of rails. The carriages crashed into the bridge, which fell onto them, and the end of the train piled up against the crashed carriage at 200 kilometers per hour. If the dragging rail rim hadn't switched the points, the crash simply would not have happened.
So what we had was the initial breakage of the wheel unleashed a series of incidents, each of which compounded the consequences, and the final consequence, of course, was the disaster when the train hit the bridge.
Embittered survivors and relatives of those killed accused Deutsche Bahn of ignoring wheel fatigue during previous wheel checks.
Well, a legal process was applied. I don't think it was as searching as it might have been, and if it had have been, I think it may have come to a conclusion that really shifted more of the responsibility for this onto bad design at Deutsche Bahn.
In 2003, a German court abandoned negligence cases against 3 Deutsche Bahn engineers, fining each of them 10,000 euros and concluding they bore no serious blame for the disaster.
The trial was very painful because the outcome was such that no one was found guilty. The fact that the engineers were given just a mild fine. The outcome of the trial was for the survivors and the families of the victims, well, it was like a slap in the face.
More than 20 years after Germany's worst rail accident, many things have changed. The Eschede disaster was one of the tragic events that led to the creation of a new federal agency in 2002 and the establishment of a psychosocial emergency care network across Germany. Edvard Hüls is still one of the lead emergency doctors in the timbered German city of Celle. The approach, he recalls, was innovative at the time.
Wir haben dieses Psychologie-Team nicht mitgebracht. Das gab es zu der damaligen Zeit überhaupt gar nicht.
We developed the psychological trauma team concept ourselves, because back then such a thing did not exist. Eschede was the first disaster where a team of counselors were brought on site to address the needs of not just the grieving and wounded, but also the rescuers who were working there. When rescuers would come out of the wreckage, they could stop in for a briefing, talk to someone. At the time, this was something very new.
Dann haben wir ein Briefing hinterher, wir sprechen mit euch. Das war etwas ganz, ganz Neues.
Within weeks, points on the entire German railway network were checked to see if they were near possible obstacles.
They then instigated a big investigation. They contacted a lot of experts of fatigue, because this failure was clearly a fatigue crack that had grown in the rim, of which I was one. We spent two and a half years arguing with each other, discussing with DB engineers, trying to find out the history of the decision to introduce these wheels, what the testing had been, what the thoughts had been about the inspection of them, and so on.
Wheels on other trains were replaced with the safer monoblock type.
My argument would be is the protocols weren't applicable to this particular incident. Stripped away from the overall view, the detail of the design of the wheel was so different, they shouldn't have applied existing design standards to it. And they shouldn't have hidden behind the fact that it complied with those existing design standards, because it was a completely different structure and it changed the system behaviour.
Trains were also refitted with windows that have predetermined braking seams, as rescue workers at the scene of the disaster had difficulty reaching victims due to the resistance of the train's pressure-proof windows. After 27 days in a medically induced coma and 6 major operations, Udo Bauch lives with a 100% handicap.
Ich habe nach wie vor, auch jetzt noch nach 20 Jahren, sehr starke Schmerzen immer wieder.
I still have very strong pain, even today, after 20 years. When I walk, it all hurts. I have a 100% handicap. There is also anxiety. My life is very, very different, and every day I have to fight through this pain and these obstacles and handicaps.
Udo Bauch decided to build his own memorial and began planning a chapel in his hometown of Eichenzell.
Many people come here. In the first year after the accident, we had 5,000 visitors. We get prayer groups, victim support groups. And it is nice to see that our town is sought out by those who want the victims of the Eschede disaster to be remembered.
Udo Bauch only received an apology some 20 years after the accident, after having to fight Deutsche Bahn every step of the way.
Deutsche Bahn was very insensitive in the time right after the disaster. They sent us letters with ICE train stamps. You had to fight for every single euro of compensation. At the time, everyone said, "We will absolutely compensate you big time." But as a victim, we did not notice that. We had to fight for every little thing. Every little bill that needed to be paid was a battle. It was a very heavy burden.
Nearly 3 years after the disaster, an official memorial was established, paid for in part by Deutsche Bahn. "400 relatives and many dignitaries, as well as rescue personnel and local Eschede residents, attended the opening ceremony. Still today, many continue to gather here on the solemn anniversary of the accident every June. "101 wild Japanese cherry trees were planted here, one for each fatality. They do not bear fruit, but blossom every spring in memory of the victims. A place of solace and reflection for families, rescuers, and the villagers of Eschede whose lives go on, despite being forever marked by the tragedy. In one's life, one can never forget the images that one at the time had to live through on the 3rd of June 1998. And every year, when the anniversary of the disaster comes around, those pictures inevitably come back, and our thoughts go back to all those who lost their lives in the derailment.
Die sind zwar ein bisschen in den Hintergrund getreten.
The memories retreated a little bit into the background, but they're still there, because every now and then I drive over and stop for a moment, looking, standing there for a brief time, and then I see everything before my eyes, just as it was.
Sieht man noch mal wieder so alles vom geistigen Auge, wie es halt war. Ne?
Passengers in the trains that speed by here every day at 200 kilometers per hour on their way to and from Hamburg are travelling too fast to see the names of all those who lost their lives here on June the 3rd, 1998. But if they happen to look out the window toward the thick forests and fields of heather as they pass by Eschede, their gaze is met by a cherry orchard planted to remember the 101 dead, and by a steep flight of stone steps leading up to a gate, framing the blue heavens beyond.